Deku? I think he's some pro. By clouds. My head in the clouds not coming down. Chapter 58. Stain. Tenya Ida ran alongside Manuel as they made their way towards the explosions in the distance. This was far too flashy to be the hero killer, but if he was still in Horseu, then he had to be taking advantage of the chaos. Tenya couldn't help looking down the alleys they passed, hoping for any glimpse of that murderer. He knew it was unlikely that he would find anything, which is why he was shocked enough to stop running when he saw a shadow with a red scarf stalking down a dark side street. He looked after Manuel, who he hadn't realized that he wasn't following anymore, then back at the shadow, which turned and disappeared around a corner. He only hesitated a moment before running into the darkness. He understood what Manuel had said about not seeking revenge, but he didn't have a choice. If that killer was allowed to keep killing, then his brother's injury would be in vain. He couldn't let that demon tarnish his brother's memory like that. He didn't bother being silent as he ran. Let the hero killer hear him. Let him turn around and face him so he could avenge his brother. The explosions and screams from the rest of the city must have been more than loud enough to cover his movements. Or maybe that the murderer didn't care, because he didn't turn around. How dare he? The hero killer turned suddenly, making Tenya lose sight of him, but he couldn't give up his search. Not when he was so close. This area of town was deserted, so either the people who lived here were asleep, or they had already evacuated. It was just as well. He didn't want any civilians getting in the way of this fight. He looked down every possible street, refusing to stop until he caught sight of the shadow again a few minutes later. This time, the murderer stood still, facing the wall of the alleyway with his katana in his hand. Tenya didn't hesitate. The hero killer turned as he heard the sound of engines, but he was the next Ingenium. He was faster than some blood-stained monster. He raised his leg to kick the hero killer in the head, but the man managed to raise his sword just in time to block the kick and knock Tenya's helmet off in one swift moment. "Run," Stain said. "This is no place for children." Tenya's heart clenched with hatred, and he scowled as he stood. He would avenge his brother if it was the last thing he ever did. Izuku ran alongside Nezu, grateful that he'd worn his hero costume today. How had the Nomus ended up in Horseu? From what Shigaraki had said at the USJ, Izuku had gotten the idea that the monster was one of a kind. But he supposed that with someone like All For One working behind the scenes, he really shouldn't have been surprised. But why Horseu of all places? There were much better places if the League wanted to inspire fear. He honestly wasn't sure what he and Nezu could do to help. His bullets weren't going to do much good against a multiple quirked monster that could regenerate itself. But they had to try. Maybe they could help with evacuation? They had finally reached the place where most of the action was. The heroes were out of their depth, struggling to get the upper hand as two separate Nomus attacked everything in sight. Fires were raging, and off to one side, they saw Manuel using his quirk to put them out. "Has anyone seen Tenya?" Manuel yelled. "He ran off!" Izuku and Nezu both froze and looked at each other. "Ida." Izuku swore and ran for the nearest fire escape. With all the chaos on the ground, it would be faster to traverse the city on the rooftops. Vaguely, he was aware of Nezu scrambling up behind him. He needed to find Ida. Hopefully before he did something stupid. Mirio followed Gran Torino as he tackled the monster out of the train. Was this... All Might had said something about a monster with multiple quirks attacking at the USJ, but this couldn't be the same guy, right? That Nomu was in jail. But this one also had an exposed brain and seemed to be attacking with little to no thought, so it had to be the same kind of creature. Gran Torino immediately started bouncing off the surrounding buildings to land hits on the Nomu, so Mirio fired up One for All and started timing his attacks, so that whenever Gran retreated, he was ready to land a hit. A normal opponent would be getting frustrated, but the Nomu simply kept attacking at the same pace. He heard a scream behind them and turned to see a pair of civilians backing away, tripping on a set of steps as they tried to get away. He smiled as brightly as he could. He had people to save. "Gran, get them to safety!" Mirio yelled. "I'll handle this guy!" Gran nodded and flew over to grab the civilians, as Mirio turned his full attention to the Nomu and started punching, turning himself intangible every time the monster tried to land a hit. His two quirks flowed together seamlessly, something he'd been struggling with ever since receiving One for All, but he didn't have time to congratulate himself before he felt a searing heat and turned himself completely intangible on instinct, sinking completely into the floor. He popped up a few seconds later and 10 feet away to see Endeavor roasting the Nomu who had just been fighting. He hadn't given him any warning before launching his attack, and if Mirio hadn't managed to turn intangible right when he did...
"What's the big idea?"
Gran ran up to Endeavor. To someone who didn't know him, Gran might seem too short to be properly intimidating, but Mirio wouldn't want to be in Endeavor's shoes at that moment.
"You almost killed my intern."
Endeavor sneered at him.
"I can handle this guy better than some child. Your intern managed to dodge, so what's the problem?" "What's the problem?"
Gran was screaming at this point.
"The problem is that you launched a dangerous attack that could have very well hurt another hero. Did you even know that Lemellion's quirk would let him dodge that?"
Mirio felt the temperature drop beside him, and he turned to see a kid around Deku's age holding a chunk of ice out to him.
"Did he burn you?"
Mirio shook his head. "I'm fine. You?" The kid nodded. "Father wouldn't do anything to seriously jeopardize my safety." He frowned and looked at the Nomu, who was starting to move again. "But this fight isn't over yet." Izuku had been concerned at first that Nezu wouldn't be able to keep up with him, because his legs were so much shorter than a human's. But somehow, Izuku had forgotten how fast animals could run if they set their minds to it. As soon as they'd gotten to the rooftops, Nezu had shifted to run on all fours, which, again, Izuku should have expected, but it was easy to forget that he wasn't human. Nezu scurried along and set the pace, with Izuku guiding them as he mentally ran through what he knew about the hero killer. He worked best in darkness, sneak attacks, so he would probably try to avoid the chaos from the Nomu attacks, which meant that they should head in the opposite direction. He mostly attacked in alleyways, and he had to be close to wherever Manuel was patrolling, otherwise Ida would have never caught sight of them. "When we find them, what happens?" Izuku asked. "We fight," Nezu said simply. "Your priority will be getting Ida to safety, but if Stain attacks you, you have my permission to defend yourself and Ida. You shouldn't get in trouble for illegal quirk usage either way, but just to be safe." Izuku nodded. "All right, just be careful. Stain is deadly." So were the people who made me, Nezu said seriously. Izuku swallowed and continued running. He had to trust that Nezu knew what he was doing, but what if they were too late? What if by the time they found Ida, he was already... Suddenly, Nezu's ears twitched and he took a sharp left. Izuku followed, straining his ears to hear what Nezu's more sensitive hearing had picked up, but all he could hear was the chaos from the Nomu attack. They ran over 2 more rooftops, before Nezu skidded to a stop, and Izuku had to concentrate to avoid tumbling over the edge of the rooftop. He glanced at Nezu, then peered over the roof. The white of Ida's hero costume stood out starkly in the half-lit light of the alleyway, as did the harsh glint of the sword hovering above his neck. They were close enough now that Izuku didn't even need superhuman hearing to catch Stain's next words.
Very well, Ingenium. May your death bring about a better world.
Chapter 59. Hero Killer. Izuku didn't know what possessed him to move. Nezu had told him that he was only supposed to get Ida to safety and leave Stain to him. But then Izuku saw the knife and knew he had to do something. Time seemed to slow down as he drew his gun and shot the blade right as it began to fall. The gunshot echoed too loudly, as the force of the bullet knocked the sword off course and sparks flew as the metal hit concrete. Izuku swallowed as Stain slowly turned to stare straight at him. Izuku's brain was working overtime. He didn't know how injured Ida was, or exactly what Stain's quirk was, or even if the other pro he saw slumped against the wall was still alive. Nezu was a few paces behind him, and was short enough that Stain probably hadn't spotted him yet, but he had most definitely seen Izuku. Neither of them had physical quirks that could overpower the hero killer, and Izuku didn't have enough experience to fight him on his own. Right now, the best option would be for Izuku to distract Stain long enough for Nezu to come up with a plan, and contact whatever backup he could. Razor was gonna kill him. Izuku discreetly took off his utility belt and dropped it to the floor, along with his grappling hook, hoping that Nezu would be able to use them in whatever scheme he was already coming up with. Then jumped off the roof, using the fire escapes and gutters to parkour his way down the alleyway. Stain simply watched his descent, eyes narrowed as he took in his new opponent.
Another child, Stain scoffed. Leave now and I'll let you live. I have business to attend to.
Let me take Ingenium, and you'll never see me again, Izuku said. Prioritize the rescue. Nezu would be able to follow Stain as long as he and Ida were safe. Let's go, Ida.
Midoriya?
Ida's voice sounded broken, and Izuku really hoped he'd be okay after all this. I can't move my body. Ever since he cut me, I've been paralyzed. Izuku frowned. That matched the theories that he'd read on Stain's quirk. So, cutting must activate his power somehow. That meant he'd have to avoid getting cut. Stain scowled.
This fake isn't worth your attention. He came here to kill me, thinking only of vengeance, not heroics. He must die. But your fate is still undecided.
Midoriya, please don't get involved, Ida pleaded.
Please, this is my fight.
No offense, Ida, Izuku said dryly, but you're not in any condition to take on the hero killer right now.
Enough,
Stain growled.
When your friend decided to fight me, it guaranteed the weaker of us would be culled. If you insist on protecting a weakless bug like him, I will have no choice but to kill you as well.
Izuku readied his gun and aimed. No one is worthless. Mirio wanted to help fight the Nomu, but it was just too dangerous to get too close to Endeavor while he fought. So he and Gran Torino were currently working on evacuating the surrounding buildings and making sure none of the civilians got hit by Endeavor's powerful fire blasts. Endeavor's son, who had introduced himself as Shoto, was trying to help them. So Gran had given him some emergency permission to use his quirk to protect others, so he could shield civilians with his ice and prevent his father's fire from weakening the already unstable buildings. The good news was that Endeavor was actually making headway against the Nomu. He seemed to be gradually overwhelming it, but it kept healing itself. Mirio remembered All Might saying they could do that, but unfortunately, the police hadn't shared a lot of information about the Nomu with the heroes, considering that they thought the one at the USJ had been the only one. All anyone knew about these monsters was that only All Might had been able to beat the last one, but unless he was miraculously in Horseu for whatever reason, they couldn't count on him to save them. Attention, all heroes. A voice cut through the static on their standard issue Hero Commission communication device. The hero killer has been spotted at 4210 Echo Street. If your quirk is ill-suited to fighting the monsters, please assist. A terrifying grin lit up on Endeavor's face, and he immediately turned away from the Nomu.
Come, Shoto.
Mirio's jaw dropped, and he looked at Gran Torino, who was scowling. Endeavor's quirk was well suited to fighting the Nomus, so why was he going to fight the hero killer? Was he really going to abandon the undefeated Nomu when there were civilians in danger?
We came to Horseu looking for Stain, Shoto explained, then sighed and jogged after his father, who was already disappearing down the street. I'm sorry.
That asshole, Gran growled. No wonder he's never been able to beat Toshinori.
Mirio swallowed and looked back at the Nomu, who had already recovered from Endeavor's last attack and was lumbering towards the few civilians still evacuating. If All Might was the only person who had ever beaten one, then that meant, as the next holder of One for All, it was his responsibility to defeat these monsters. He let the lighting of his quirk surround him as he ran to stand between the Nomu and the fleeing civilians.
Smash!
Izuku's aim was good, but Stain's reflexes had been honed by years of life and death combat, so the bullet barely grazed his arm as he lunged forward, sword in hand. Izuku jumped back, trying not to step on Ida as he holstered his gun and grabbed Stain's arm and tried to yank it behind his back. Stain, however, simply twisted, forcing Izuku to let go of his arm. They both took a step back, panting and waiting for the other to make the next move.
Stop!
Ida tried.
Midoriya, save yourself!
Shut up, Ida, I'm not leaving you, Izuku snapped. That's not what a hero does. Stain straightened and eyed Izuku curiously.
Interesting. You may have what it takes to be a real hero, not one of these useless fakes, if you commit yourself to protecting those who are actually innocent.
Izuku glanced at Ida and Native, then at Stain. If he could hold a conversation, that would be safer than fighting while he waited for Nezu to make his move. He followed Stain's lead and relaxed his stance. What do you think a true hero is? The fire in Stain's eyes was fanatic.
Someone who saves others without expecting anything in return. The broken system keeps churning out self-righteous celebrities who couldn't care less about the people they defend. So far, the only true hero I've seen is All Might.
Izuku bit his lip. The safe option would be to pretend he agreed with Stain, but then the conversation would be over. And if Nezu wasn't ready yet, then... The other option was to try and fight him on ideology. That could potentially make him angry, but it would drag out the conversation and take attention off Ida. He was probably gonna regret this. I don't know if even All Might qualifies as a true hero. The passion in Stain's eyes turned to rage.
What did you say?
Izuku forced himself to sound nonchalant. Have you seen all the merchandise All Might has? He's probably one of the most famous heroes to ever exist. That doesn't sound like your definition of a hero at all. If anything, you should be praising underground heroes. They don't care about the media at all.
All Might didn't ask for his fame, Stain growled. He uses it to give people hope.
Izuku shrugged. If that's what you choose to believe.
Why, you...
Izuku made it look like he was rolling his eyes, but really, he was glancing up to see if Nezu was ready. He saw Nezu peeking over the edge of the roof, and held back a sigh of relief. Well, so far all he'd been able to do was antagonize a dangerous killer, so he may as well make him more angry. Maybe then he'd make a mistake. All I'm saying... Izuku held his hands out in mock surrender. Is that All Might isn't as great as you're making him out to be. Heroes are supposed to give people hope, right? Well, when I first met All Might, he didn't waste any time telling me I couldn't be a hero. Does that sound like something a true hero does? Stain scowled and shifted back to his battle stance.
All Might would be able to recognize a true hero. So if he said you couldn't be one, then you're just another fake. And for that, you must die.
Izuku swallowed and got ready to run. You've been blinded by his fame. You think that you're killing to fix the system, but really you're just a deranged All Might fanboy. Stain lunged forward, but before he could reach Izuku, Nezu dropped a flash grenade right down into the alley. Izuku screwed his eyes shut right before it hit, and when he opened it again, the alley was filled with effects from one of his smoke bombs. Stain was swinging blindly now, but Izuku simply ducked and ran to grab Native by the collar and drag him over to Ida. He felt the tip of a blade at his neck and froze. On the other end was Stain, his eyes bloodshot but definitely filled with rage, and focused on Izuku. He'd recovered from the flash grenade a lot faster than Izuku had been planning on. Izuku swallowed and tried to brace himself for the blow. But before Stain could kill him, there was a zipping sound, and then a clang as Izuku's grappling hook embedded itself into the wall. Stain looked at it in confusion, which meant he was still staring in the wrong direction when Nezu retracted the wire and used the momentum to fly at Stain and kick him in the head with his entire body weight. Izuku took that as his cue to grab Ida and Native and run. Behind him, he could hear Nezu growling and biting as Stain tried to dislodge him. It was hard to believe that the normally composed principal was capable of defeating the hero killer alone, but more heroes should be showing up soon, so Izuku needed to prioritize the rescue. He didn't stop running until he reached the street. He propped Ida and Native against an opposite wall so he had a clear view of the alley, in case Nezu needed help. Are you two okay? I still can't move, Native said weakly. Other than that, just some stab wounds and some road rash from where you dragged me. Izuku winced. I'm so sorry. It's just with the two of you.
It's all right, Midoriya, Ida said. It's better than what would have happened to us if we'd stayed in the hands of that murderer.
Thank you. Speaking of, why did I have to save you, Ida? Izuku knew that the stress of the situation was probably getting to him, but he couldn't help snapping at him. Why wouldn't you just talk to us? How could you possibly think that seeking revenge was a good idea?
Ida bowed slightly. I wasn't thinking. All I could focus on was my anger.
Wait.
Native looked at Ida in shock.
Can you move?
Ida's eyes widened, and he raised his hand slowly.
Yes.
How? Izuku's brain was rushing again.
Stain's quirk must have a time limit. But that can't be right, Native said. I was paralyzed before Ingenium even showed up, and I still can't move. Maybe the size of the cut? Izuku said. But you both have similar sized stab wounds. Wait. Considering the size of his tongue. Did he lick the blades before you were paralyzed?
Ida and Native exchanged a glance, and Ida nodded. I believe so, yes.
I thought he was just being weird, Native said.
Izuku shook his head.
It most likely has to do with blood type. So you have different blood types?
I'm B, Native said. And I'm A, Ida said.
Okay.
Izuku muttered absently.
So it has a different time limit based on blood type, but that means that there's no way of knowing how his quirk will affect Nezu since human blood types don't translate into animals. Will Stain's quirk even work on him? Unless, of course, the scientists spliced human DNA into him along with all the other animals they used.
The sounds of the fight could still be heard from the alley, and Izuku glanced over to see that the smoke had mostly cleared. Nezu was still holding his own, using a combination of punches and bites to target Stain's pressure points and ligaments. One of the hero killer's arms was already hanging limply by his side, and he seemed to be trying to stay in one place as much as possible, so Nezu had probably managed to injure at least one of his legs, but Izuku knew better than most how easily adrenaline could numb even severe pain, so whatever injury Stain had, it probably wouldn't hold him back for long.
We should help. Other heroes should be showing up soon, but until then, we can't leave Nezu to fight alone. Are you with me, Ida?
Ida nodded and stood.
You two crazy?
Native asked.
You're just two students.
He just about killed you last time. We have to try, Ida said. It is my fault Nezu is even fighting the hero killer. I can't let him die. Midoriya, Ida. Izuku turned and saw Todoroki and Endeavor running towards them.
Todoroki?
Where is the hero killer? Endeavor scowled. Is this your idea of a prank? Izuku returned Endeavor's glare and pointed to the alley, where the sound of metal on concrete was still clearly audible.
Hurry! There's already a hero here, but he won't be able to defeat Stain alone.
Endeavor ran into the alley, and Izuku breathed a sigh of relief. As terrible a person Endeavor was, his skill at taking down villains was undeniable. Nezu would be all right. What now?
Oh, right. First aid. Todoroki, can you make some ice for Ida and Native? We need to stop the bleeding, and the cold will help with that.
Todoroki nodded and handed Izuku a chunk of ice, before crouching down beside Native and frosting over his right hand to apply pressure to his shoulder. Izuku made Ida sit down again and tried to stop the bleeding from the hole in his arm. Most of his medical supplies were in the utility belt he'd given to Nezu, but maybe Todoroki had a few? You're not hurt, are you, Midoriya?
Todoroki asked suddenly. Izuku shook his head. I'm fine. Stain didn't really have a chance to hurt me before Nezu stepped in. Speaking of Nezu, he chose that moment to scurry out of the alley, looking scorched as he patted his arms frantically to put out the little fires and embers that had gotten caught in his fur. Why did it have to be Endeavor who came to our aid? It's like he didn't even care I was there. Oh, hello Todoroki. How is your internship going? Todoroki seemed surprised by Nezu actually acknowledging him.
Fine.
Nezu nodded. And you're already applying first aid? Very good. I'm happy to see that Aizawa hasn't been slacking in our training. How is everybody doing? Now that Nezu was safe, and Izuku could actually get a good look at him, he noticed that he could use some first aid himself. In addition to small burns from Endeavor, Nezu was bleeding from multiple injuries, and since he'd been fighting Stain at close range, Izuku's theory about him being immune to Stain's quirk because of a non-Huron blood type was probably correct. Hopefully, Stain would be imprisoned before they had to use that knowledge, though.
We're doing as well as we can be expected, Principal Nezu, sir,
Endeavor said.
Thank you and Midoriya for coming to our aid.
Nezu's expression hardened. Ida, we will be addressing this before you return to UA. Ida swallowed and bowed his head.
I understand. I must apologize.
Izuku turned out Ida's rambling apology as he suddenly realized it was a bit cooler than it had been since Endeavor had joined the fight. Had he beaten the hero killer already? Izuku glanced over towards the alley, and his eyes widened. Endeavor was crumpled on the ground. His ever-present flames were gone, and the only sign he was even still alive was the intense look of hatred on his face. The hero killer limped towards him, sword sparking as he dragged it on concrete. For the second time that night, Izuku didn't have time to think, before he was already moving. Hey, it's Mika. If you enjoyed this podfic, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel or following me on Spotify for updates and new content weekly. Also, consider supporting me on Ko-Fi, link in the description. Anyways, I hope that you have a great day or night, and that your favorite author posts the exact fanfiction you visualized when you were meant to be doing work yesterday. Until next time.